She'll beg to return within a week, Lady Maud Sinclair announced to the drawing-room at large, though her words were aimed like a poisoned dart at the still figure on the threshold. The world has no place for sentimental little fools with more pride than sense. Harriet Bellamy did not turn. She stood on the top step of the London townhouse that had been her prison for 10 years, a single worn trunk at her feet. She did not look back at her aunt's cruel, satisfied face, nor at the pale, wavering expression of her cousin Rosamond. Instead, she looked at the grey London sky, feeling the damp chill of the November air on her cheeks. It felt like freedom. The small, begrudgingly dispensed purse in her reticule contained the last of her mother's dowry, a sum her aunt had controlled and diminished for a decade. It was meant to be an insult, a pittance to see her starve quietly and out of sight. Lady Maud did not know that for 3 years Harriet had been planning for this day. While her aunt and cousin attended balls and fittings, Harriet had been the silent engine of the Sinclair household. She managed the ledgers, stretching every pound. She oversaw the staff, negotiated with tradesmen, and ensured the illusion of seamless aristocratic life continued, even as the Sinclair fortunes dwindled. Her payment was a roof over her head and the constant, grating reminder of her dependency. Every night, in the privacy of her small attic room, she had studied maps and memorized deeds. She read agricultural almanacs and treatises on soil composition. Her competence, the very quality her aunt exploited, was the tool of her own liberation. She did not need to beg. She had a plan. Her trunk was lifted onto the waiting mail coach, the sound heavy and final in the quiet street. Inside were not fine dresses, but sturdy boots, woolen stockings, her mother's worn gardening gloves, and a dozen notebooks filled with her precise, elegant script, detailing crop rotations and drainage plans. She climbed into the coach without a backward glance. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. As the coach rattled over the cobblestones, away from the life that had tried to erase her, she thought of a name whispered in her mother's last, fevered letters. A place of tangled roses and fallen stone. Bramblehurst Park. A ruin, her aunt had called it. A folly. To Harriet, it was a promise. The journey north was cold and tedious, but with every mile that separated her from London, a knot inside her chest seemed to loosen. She was not running from something, but towards it. The town of Marley was nestled in a fold of the moors, its stone buildings hunched against the wind. It was smaller and rougher than she had imagined, the air sharp with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Her inquiries led her to the office of Mr. Fletcher, the local solicitor, a man whose dry, dusty demeanor seemed a perfect match for his stacks of parchment. He peered at her over his spectacles, his expression a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. A lone woman, unchaperoned, asking to purchase a derelict property was an anomaly. "Bramblehurst Park," he said, drawing out the words. "My dear Miss Bellamy, the place is a ruin. Has been for 20 years. The land is sour, and the house is fit only for crows." Harriet sat opposite him, her back straight, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "I am aware of its conditions, sir. I have the funds to purchase the deed, such as it is." She pushed a small, neatly written document across the desk, a summary of her finances and a formal offer. He picked it up, his eyebrows rising. The sum was modest, but it was clearly all she had. It was the exact amount listed in the county records for the derelict property's tax value. She had done her research. Before he could formulate a response, the door to his office opened, admitting a blast of cold air and a man who seemed to carry the authority of the landscape itself. He was tall and severe, dressed in dark, impeccably tailored riding clothes that spoke of function, not fashion. His face was stark, carved with lines of grief or hardship that had settled into a permanent mask of indifference. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray, swept the room and settled on Harriet with an unnerving intensity. "Devereux," Mr. Fletcher stammered, scrambling to his feet. "Your Grace, I was not expecting you." The Duke of Kestrel Chase, Gideon Devereux, inclined his head a fraction of an inch. His gaze did not leave Harriet. "I was riding by. I saw the coach. News travels in a place like Marley." His voice was low and gravelly, a sound that seemed to come from some deep, quiet place. He did not speak again, simply moved to stand by the hearth, one hand resting on the mantelpiece, an imposing, silent observer. The solicitor, flustered, turned back to Harriet. "As I was saying, Miss Bellamy, the matter is not so simple. There are complications, encumbrances." "The water rights," Harriet stated, her voice even. It was not a question. Mr. Fletcher's jaw dropped slightly. "You are aware?" "I am aware that the stream which feeds the lower meadows of Bramblehurst originates on the Kestrel Chase estate," she said calmly, "and that an agreement for access lapsed 17 years ago upon the death of the previous owner, my great-uncle." The Duke's stillness intensified. He was watching her, she knew, not with the predatory gaze of a man assessing a woman, but with the focused attention of a hawk spotting something unexpected in the undergrowth. He had expected, she supposed, a flighty city miss playing at country life. He had not expected a woman who had read 2 decades' worth of county deeds and water charters. "The estate is worthless without that access," Mr. Fletcher said, regaining his composure and seizing the advantage. "His Grace has no obligation to grant it." "I am not asking for a gift," Harriet replied, turning her head at last to meet the Duke's gaze directly. Her own eyes were a steady, quiet brown, unafraid. "I am proposing a transaction." For the first time, a flicker of something, not warmth but perhaps interest, disturbed the cold surface of the Duke's expression. He pushed himself away from the mantelpiece and took a step forward. "What transaction?" he asked, his voice cutting through the solicitor's sputtering. Harriet held his gaze. This was the moment, the culmination of all her planning, all her secret study. "A 5-year lease on the water rights," she said, her voice clear and strong in the quiet room. "In exchange for 10% of the net profit from the cultivation of medicinal herbs on the Bramblehurst lands. A formal contract, to be reviewed annually." Mr. Fletcher looked aghast. The sheer audacity of it. But Gideon Devereux did not laugh. He looked at this small, plain woman in her sensible gray dress, a woman who spoke not of hopes or dreams, but of contracts and net profits. She had not pleaded or flattered or wept. She had come with a ledger in her soul. "You intend to farm it yourself?" he asked, one dark eyebrow raised. "I do," she said. He was silent for a long count of seconds. 1, 2, 3. He was assessing her, weighing her resolve. He saw no coquetry, no feminine wiles. He saw only a strange, unyielding strength. It was a quality he understood. It was a quality he respected. "Draw up a temporary agreement, Fletcher," the Duke said, his voice final. "For 1 season, through the winter. We will see if Miss Bellamy's crop bears fruit." He turned his gaze back to Harriet, and it held a warning. "But if you fail, the land reverts, and you will leave Marley. Plainly?" "Plainly," she answered, her voice unwavering. And in that single word, a pact was sealed. Not of friendship or alliance, but of mutual, grudging recognition. A woman with a desperate plan had met a man who had forgotten how to feel anything but the cold, hard weight of facts. And for the first time in a long time, Gideon Devereux was intrigued. The deed to Bramblehurst Park, signed and sealed, felt impossibly heavy in Harriet's hand. It was a flimsy piece of parchment, but it represented the first thing in her life that was truly hers. The house itself was another matter. Mr. Fletcher had not exaggerated. It was a skeleton picked clean by years of wind and rain. Windows were boarded or shattered, slates were missing from the roof like lost teeth, and ivy had forced its way through the mortar, strangling the stone in a green embrace. The front door groaned open under her shoulder to reveal a hall thick with the dust of decades. Moonlight struggled through a grime-caked fanlight, illuminating swirling moats and the ghostly shapes of furniture shrouded in white cloths. The air was cold and dead, smelling of damp, decay, and forgotten things. Any other woman would have turned and fled. Harriet took a deep, steadying breath. She had not expected a palace. She had expected a beginning. She set down her trunk, the sound echoing in the profound silence. This was her home. For the first 2 weeks, she lived in a single downstairs room, the old morning room, which had the soundest windows and a hearth that, after a day of choking smoke, finally drew properly. She slept on a cot, her few belongings stored in her trunk. By day, she worked until her muscles screamed and her hands were raw. She swept away layers of dust and grime, cleared fallen plaster, and fought a pitched battle with the mice who had claimed the house as their domain. She was entirely alone, but she did not feel lonely. The work was honest, and the results, however small, were her own. On the 3rd day, a visitor appeared at her door. An older woman with a face as weathered as the local stone and eyes that missed nothing. "You'll be the Bellamy girl," the woman said, not unkindly. "I'm Hannah. I was in service here as a girl for your great-aunt." Harriet invited her in, offering her a cup of the tea she brewed over the fire. Hannah looked around the clean-swept corner of the room, at the neatly stacked firewood, at Harriet's mended dress. She noted the ledger Harriet used to track her expenses, open on a small crate. "They say in the village you'll not last the winter," Hannah remarked, accepting the tea. "They say the Duke is waiting for you to fail." "The Duke will be disappointed," Harriet said quietly. A slow smile creased Hannah's face. "I think he might." From that day on, Hannah came every morning. She asked for no wages, but accepted payment in shared meals and the satisfaction of seeing the old house slowly coming back to life. She knew its secrets, which floorboards creaked, which chimney drew best, where the old well was. Together, they made the kitchen habitable, scrubbing the great stone flags and polishing the long-neglected copper pots until they shone with a faint, warm light. It was Hannah who showed her the walled garden. Hidden behind a high stone wall and a heavy, iron-bound door that had rusted shut, it was a secret, forgotten world. It had once been the heart of the estate. Now it was a wilderness of thorns and weeds, the ghosts of paths barely visible beneath the overgrowth. But the walls offered shelter from the wind, and the southern exposure meant the sun lingered here longer than anywhere else. The soil, when Harriet crumbled it between her fingers, was dark and rich. "This is the place," she whispered, a sense of rightness settling over her. This was where she would plant her future. They worked for a week to clear a single patch of ground, their hands bleeding from thorn scratches. It was back-breaking, relentless labor. But as the good earth was revealed, Harriet felt a fierce, protective joy. It was here, in the walled garden, that the Duke found her. He did not announce himself, but simply appeared, a dark silhouette on his black horse, watching from the rise beyond the wall. Harriet was on her knees, pulling stubbornly at the root of a thorny bramble, her face smudged with dirt, her hair escaping its pins. She was aware of his presence long before she looked up. She felt his gaze like a change in the weather. When she finally met his eyes, she did not flush or stammer. She simply gave a slight nod of acknowledgement and returned to her task. He watched her for a long time, his expression unreadable. He saw not a lady playing at gardening, but a woman at work. He saw the methodical way she cleared the ground, the strength in her hands, the unyielding set of her jaw. He had come expecting to see the first signs of failure, of surrender. He saw, instead, the first signs of life. He wheeled his horse around and rode away without a word. But the next morning, a cart from the Kestrel Chase estate arrived at Bramblehurst. It was loaded with seasoned oak logs, enough to last her through the deepest part of winter. The driver, a grim-faced man named Jem, unloaded it without comment, touched his cap, and left. There was no note, no message. None was needed. It was not a gift of charity. It was a gesture of respect. A silent admission that he had, perhaps, underestimated the woman of Bramblehurst Park. And as Harriet stacked the wood, its clean, sharp scent filling the air, she felt the first, tentative flicker of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in her hearth. The quiet rhythm of Harriet's new life settled in with the first snows of winter. The days were short, the work was hard, but it was a life of her own making. Inside the walled garden, protected by makeshift cold frames she and Hannah had constructed from old window panes, the first green shoots of horehound and thyme began to push through the cold earth. Each tiny leaf was a victory. The house, too, was slowly yielding. 2 more rooms were now habitable, the windows properly glazed by a glazier from Marley who, after initial skepticism, had been won over by Harriet's prompt payment and clear instructions. The chill of long abandonment was slowly being replaced by the scent of beeswax, drying herbs, and wood smoke. Gideon Devereux continued his silent observations. His rides took him past the edge of her property almost daily. He never approached, never spoke, but his presence was a constant, brooding weight on the landscape. Harriet grew accustomed to it, sensing him the way a wild creature senses a predator, except he did not feel like a threat. He felt like a witness. She learned to read the signs of his passage: a hoofprint in the mud, a gate left carefully closed, the distant silhouette of horse and rider against the gray sky. It was a strange, silent communication. He was watching her reclaim her life, and in doing so, he was being forced to acknowledge his own. One afternoon, a fierce storm blew in from the moors, rattling the old house to its foundations. A section of the roof over the unused west wing, weakened by years of neglect, finally gave way with a great crash. Rain poured into the derelict rooms below. Harriet and Hannah worked frantically with buckets and oilcloths to contain the damage, but it was a losing battle. The water threatened to spread to the main part of the house. Just as despair began to set in, 2 men from the Kestrel Chase estate appeared at the door, sent, they said, by His Grace. They were roofers, and they worked with quiet efficiency, securing a heavy tarpaulin over the gaping hole, stopping the deluge. When Harriet tried to pay them, they refused. "The Duke's orders," was all they would say. That evening, as the storm abated, she walked to the edge of her property, to the old stone wall that separated Bramblehurst from Kestrel Chase. She knew he would come. She waited, the cold air sharp in her lungs, until she saw him riding towards her through the twilight. He reined in his horse a few feet away. In the fading light, the harsh lines of his face seemed softer. "Your Grace," she said, her voice steady, "I am in your debt." "There is no debt," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "A neighbor's duty." "Nevertheless, I thank you." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the dripping of water from the trees. "The roof will need to be properly repaired before the next heavy snow," he stated. "I am aware." "It will be expensive." "I will manage it." He looked at her determined face illuminated by the rising moon. He saw the exhaustion in the lines around her eyes, but also the resolute strength that never seemed to waver. He thought of his own home, Kestrel Chase, a place of perfect, cold order. A magnificent, echoing mausoleum where he lived with the ghost of his wife and the bitterness of a past betrayal. He saw what she was building here, not just a home, but a life, coaxed from rubble and ruin. And he felt a strange, unwelcome pang of something that might have been envy. "Why here, Miss Bellamy?" he asked, the question more abrupt than he intended. "Why this place?" Harriet looked towards the dark shape of the house, its windows now glowing with a single warm point of candlelight. "Because it was my mother's dream," she said softly. "And because no one believed I could do it." He understood that. He understood the grim satisfaction of proving the world wrong. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "See that you do," he said, and turned his horse, melting back into the shadows. Harriet watched him go, a strange ache in her chest. It was not pity. It was something harder and more respectful. It was recognition. Two solitary souls, each tending the ruins of their own inheritance, speaking a language of silence across a crumbling stone wall. The winter deepened, but inside Bramblehurst, something was taking root. The first whispers from London arrived with a package of seeds Harriet had ordered. The shopkeeper in Marley, while wrapping her parcel, mentioned offhandedly that the new Lady Garrick, formerly Miss Sinclair, had been telling everyone on her last visit to the county that her poor cousin had gone mad and was living in squalor. Harriet felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She had known her aunt and cousin would not simply let her disappear. Her quiet success was an affront to them, a judgment on the life they had chosen. Their arrival in Marley a fortnight later was therefore not a surprise, but it was a shock nonetheless. They swept into the village in a lacquered carriage, Lady Maud regal in velvet and furs, Rosamond looking pretty and brittle, and Rosamond's new husband, Percival Garrick, at their side. He was a handsome man, polished to a high sheen, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Harriet had always found him unsettling. They took rooms at the finest inn, and their purpose soon became clear: to reclaim Harriet, or, failing that, to destroy her reputation. Lady Maud began a campaign of pity, telling anyone who would listen about her poor, deluded niece, hinting at a mental fragility that made her unfit to live alone. Percival Garrick was more subtle. He spoke of his concern for Harriet's safety, of the dangers for a woman alone, all while casting doubt on her business sense and the propriety of her arrangement with the Duke. Rosamond, caught between loyalty to her mother and a flicker of conscience, simply looked miserable. The village, which had begun to accept Harriet, grew wary. Doors that had been open to her were now politely closed. The tide of opinion, so hard won, was turning against her. One morning, Harriet found the gate to her walled garden broken. The heavy iron hinge snapped. A number of her cold frames were overturned, the delicate glass shattered, the tender seedlings exposed to the killing frost. It was petty, cruel vandalism. There was no proof, but she knew with a chilling certainty who was responsible. Percival Garrick. This was his warning. She did not go to the magistrate. What could she say? That her cousin's husband had a cruel smile? She and Hannah simply cleaned up the mess, salvaged what they could, and repaired the gate. But a new, cold fear had taken root alongside her herbs. Her quiet sanctuary had been breached. The Duke, who had been away in York on business, returned to find the village buzzing with gossip. His housekeeper, a stern woman loyal to his interests, informed him of the Sinclairs' arrival and the whispers that now followed Miss Bellamy. That afternoon, he rode to Bramblehurst. He found Harriet in the garden, her hands bandaging a split stem on a promising lavender plant. "I hear you have visitors," he said, his voice clipped. Harriet did not look up from her work. "My aunt and cousin are staying in the village." "And Mr. Garrick?" It was a statement, not a question. "Yes." He dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel path. He stood over her, a formidable presence. "The talk in the village is that I have taken advantage of you, that our arrangement is improper." Harriet finished tying the small bandage and finally looked up at him. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. "The talk in the village is malicious nonsense, Your Grace, planted by those who wish to see me fail." "Garrick," he said. "He has the look of a man who enjoys the misfortunes of others." "He is my cousin's husband," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. It was a shield, this composure. He had seen it from the first day in the solicitor's office. But now, for the first time, he saw the fine cracks in it. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the faint tremor in her hands as she gathered her tools. He saw the cost of her endurance. His own history with betrayal was a raw, unhealed wound. His late wife's charming cousin had embezzled a fortune from the estate, smiling all the while. Gideon had seen firsthand how polite, smiling men could be the most dangerous. He recognized the same predatory emptiness in Percival Garrick's eyes. "He will not stop at gossip," Gideon said, his voice low. It was a warning. "I know," Harriet whispered, and for a moment the mask slipped entirely. He saw the fear and the exhaustion she fought so hard to conceal. A sudden, fierce, and entirely unfamiliar protective instinct surged through him. It was a feeling he had thought long dead. He wanted to smash Garrick's smiling face. He wanted to burn Lady Maud's pitying lies from the air. He wanted to stand between this quiet, determined woman and the world that sought to crush her. But he did none of those things. He had learned long ago that grand gestures were useless. Action, cold and precise, was what mattered. "Fortify the gate," he said, his tone returning to its usual brusque command. "I will send a man to help. And document everything, every broken pane of glass, every trampled plant. Keep a record." He was offering her not comfort, but a strategy. He was treating her not as a damsel in distress, but as a fellow commander facing an attack. It was the greatest courtesy he could pay her. "I will," she said, her composure restored. "Thank you." He mounted his horse, his face once again an impenetrable mask. But as he rode away, he knew something had shifted, irrevocably. Her fight was no longer hers alone. An attack on Bramblehurst was now an attack on his own borders. And Gideon Devereux did not suffer trespassers gladly. Percival Garrick had made a grave miscalculation. He thought he was tormenting a helpless woman. He did not realize he had just declared war on a duke. The attack, when it came, was more devastating than Harriet could have imagined. A late spring thaw, combined with an unnaturally heavy rain, had swollen the stream that flowed from Kestrel Chase down through her meadows. It was high, but manageable. Until one night, when she was awoken by a roar. She rushed to the window to see a torrent of brown water surging through her lower fields, swamping the newly planted beds of chamomile and valerian. The sluice gate, the one that regulated the flow from the Duke's lands, had been forced fully open. Her fields, the product of months of back-breaking work, were being destroyed. By the time she and Hannah reached the gate, the damage was done. The mechanism had been tampered with, a lever jammed with a piece of metal to hold it wide open. Lying half-buried in the mud nearby was a small, distinctive tool, a specialized weeding fork that Harriet had designed herself and had the blacksmith in Marley fashion for her. It had been taken from her potting shed. It was a plant, a piece of evidence left for one person to find. She was still standing there, numb with shock as the gray dawn broke, when the Duke arrived. He took in the scene with one sweeping, grim glance, the flooded fields, the broken gate, and the damning piece of evidence at her feet. His face was like granite. "What is this?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Percival Garrick's plan was diabolical in its simplicity. It looked as though Harriet, in a desperate and foolish attempt to get more water for her crops, had broken the gate herself and caused the flood. It was an act of gross negligence, a violation of their agreement. "The gate was forced," Harriet said, her own voice sounding thin and distant to her ears. "Someone jammed it open." "With your tool," he stated, his gray eyes boring into her. This was the moment of crisis. All her work, all her sacrifice, balanced on the knife edge of his trust. And she could see the doubt in his eyes, the old, familiar suspicion of a man long accustomed to betrayal. He had been betrayed before by someone he trusted. Why should she be any different? All the village gossip, all of Garrick's insidious whispers would now rush into this vacuum of doubt, confirming his worst fears. He wanted to believe her. A part of him, the part that had watched her raise a home from ruins with nothing but grit and determination, screamed that this was a lie. But the older, wounded part of him whispered that he had been a fool to trust anyone, especially a woman with so much to gain. He felt a cold fury, as much at himself as at her. "My contract with you was based on competence, Miss Bellamy," he said, the words falling like chips of ice. "This is not competence. This is ruin." For a single, terrible moment, Harriet felt the urge to weep, to plead, to protest her innocence with frantic cries. It was what her aunt would have expected. It was what any other woman might have done. But she had spent a lifetime learning to swallow tears and rely on facts. She straightened her shoulders and met his cold gaze without flinching. Her heart was breaking, but her voice was steady. "The pin holding the lever is sheer steel. It would have taken a great deal of force to break it. More than I possess," she said, her tone level and precise, as if she were giving testimony. "The jam itself is a blacksmith's rasp, wedged in at an angle to cause maximum damage. It is not an accident. It is sabotage. I did not do this. You must choose what you believe." She held his gaze, her own clear and unwavering. She offered no more defense. The truth was all she had. She had laid it before him,
and the choice was now his. Gideon's perspective. He looked at her standing there, mud on her skirts, devastation in her fields, and a core of absolute, unyielding stillness in her eyes. Every instinct he had honed since the war, since his wife's death, since the great betrayal that had hollowed out his life, screamed at him to see the deception. The evidence was there. Her tool, her motive, a desperate need for water after a dry spell. It fit the narrative Garrick had been so carefully weaving. A woman out of her depth, making a fatal error. And yet, he saw her face. He remembered her on her knees in the garden, patiently mending a single broken plant. He remembered her voice in the solicitor's office, speaking not of hopes, but of profit margins and 5-year plans.
He remembered the calluses on her hands when she had accidentally brushed his as he handed her a fallen hammer. This was not a woman of frantic, desperate acts. This was a woman of calculation, of patience, of immense, infuriating control. His mind raced, replaying her words. A blacksmith's rasp, sheer steel. She wasn't pleading, she was analyzing. She was giving him data as if the scene were a problem in engineering, not the ruin of her life's ambition. And then he saw it, truly saw it, the pure, calculated cruelty of the act. It was designed not just to ruin her, but to frame her, to make her look foolish and incompetent, the two things she valued most. It was a character assassination, executed with a lever and a rasp. It was Percival Garrick's signature, written in mud and water. The doubt in his mind did not vanish. It was torn apart by a sudden, violent clarity. He had been so close to making the same mistake again, to letting the ghosts of his past blind him to the truth standing right in front of him. This quiet, stubborn woman was the most honest person he had met in a decade. His trust had been tested, and he had almost failed. The realization filled him with a cold, self-directed rage. He looked from her pale, resolute face to the muddy water covering her land. This was not her failure. It was his. He had allowed this to happen on his watch. He had let the vipers into her garden. "I know what I believe," he said, and the ice in his voice was gone, replaced by something harder, hotter. A promise. He turned his gaze toward the village, toward the inn where Garrick was sleeping the sleep of the smug and the vicious. "And I know what must be done." We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The public inquiry was held in the Marley Town Hall, a drafty room that smelled of damp wool and old paper. It had been convened ostensibly to discuss the property damage and the ongoing dispute over the Bramblehurst water rights. But everyone in the packed room knew it was a trial. Harriet Bellamy's trial. She sat alone on a hard wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap. She wore her best dress, a simple dark wool, mended and clean. She looked small and isolated, a sparrow before a council of owls. Across the room sat her accusers, Lady Maud radiating an aura of sorrowful concern that was more damning than any overt accusation. Rosamond, looking pale and sick, refusing to meet Harriet's eye. And Percival Garrick, the picture of a respectable gentleman, his expression one of grave disappointment. The magistrate, a portly man named Ingram, who was easily swayed by wealth and title, began the proceedings. He called Percival Garrick to speak first.
Garrick's testimony was a masterpiece of insinuation. He spoke of his deep affection for his wife's cousin. He spoke of his fears for her unstable temperament. He described finding the broken sluice gate and his horror at seeing Harriet's own tool used in its destruction. "One can only conclude," he finished, his voice resonating with false sympathy, "that in a moment of desperation, she made a tragic and costly mistake. We do not wish to press charges, of course. We only wish for her to return to London, to our care." A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. It was a reasonable, compassionate explanation. It painted Harriet as a pitiable, unstable creature in need of rescue. It was a lie that would condemn her to a life of imprisonment as surely as any iron bars. The magistrate then called on Harriet. She walked to the front of the room, her steps measured, her head held high. She placed her meticulously kept ledger on the table. "Mr. Garrick is mistaken," she began, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "I was not desperate for water. According to my own records of rainfall and soil moisture, the stream was providing adequate irrigation."
Opening the sluice gate further would have been not only unnecessary, but detrimental. It was an act of malice, not of need. She then produced the blacksmith's rasp that had been used to jam the gate. "This is a tool for shaping metal. It has no place on a farm. It was left by a man who understands force and leverage, but not the land." Her words were clear, logical, and utterly without emotion. But they were the words of an unsupported woman against a wealthy, well-regarded gentleman. She could see the disbelief on the faces in the crowd. She had facts, but he had status. And then, an unexpected voice cut through the room. "The girl speaks the truth. She has more sense in her little finger than that popinjay has in his entire overstuffed waistcoat." All heads turned. Lady Octavia Fenwick, the county's most formidable and sharp-tongued dowager, had risen from her seat. She was a woman who feared no one, and whose good opinion was a currency more valuable than gold. "I have visited Miss Bellamy at Bramblehurst," she announced, her voice like cracking ice. "I have seen her work. She is a cultivator, not a destroyer. As for you, Mr. Garrick, I have been making some inquiries of my own. It seems you have a history of convenient misfortunes befalling those who stand between you and an inheritance." Garrick's polished smile faltered. A gasp went through the room. But before he could respond, the great doors of the hall swung open. Gideon Devereux strode in, his presence silencing all other noise. He did not look at the magistrate or the crowd. He looked only at Harriet, a look of profound, unwavering support. "This inquiry is a farce," the Duke said, his voice ringing with cold authority. "The matter of the sluice gate is a criminal one, and I have already presented evidence to the county sheriff. Evidence that proves Mr. Garrick hired a man from the next town to break the gate and plant Miss Bellamy's tool." He threw a signed, sworn confession onto the magistrate's table. The man flinched as if it were a snake. Percival Garrick's face went white. Lady Maud looked as if she had been struck. "But that is not why I am here," the Duke continued, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more personal. He turned to the crowd. "You have all been told a story about Miss Bellamy. A story of a foolish, unstable woman. Now you will hear the truth." He held up a slim, leather-bound document. "This is the last will and testament of her great-uncle, the previous owner of Bramblehurst Park. It was filed and then mysteriously lost from the county records 20 years ago, shortly after Lady Maud Sinclair was named executor. I had my London solicitors find the original. He opened it. It states quite clearly that the entirety of the Bramblehurst estate, along with a trust of £10,000 for its upkeep, was to be held for Harriet Bellamy until her 25th birthday. Not as a ruin to be bought with her last pennies, but as her rightful, debt-free inheritance. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by a choked sob from Rosamond. Lady Maud looked as if she had turned to stone. Percival Garrick, seeing his entire web of deceit unravel, made a move for the door, but found his way blocked by two stern-faced men from Kestrel Chase. The Duke took a step closer to Harriet. Lady Maud and her new son-in-law suppressed this will, he said, his voice clear and damning. They kept Miss Bellamy in a state of poverty and dependence, using her skills to run their own household while denying her the means to build her own. They hoped she would fail here, so they could seize the land for themselves, as Garrick has done with two other such troublesome properties I have since learned about. He had not just defended her. He had systematically dismantled her enemies with cold, irrefutable evidence. He had given her back not just her reputation, but her history, her legacy. He had brought the truth into the light.
The public reckoning was complete. Every whisper, every lie had been burned away in the fire of his cold, righteous anger. Harriet stood there, looking at him, and for the first time she felt tears threatening. Not of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming gratitude that was so deep it felt like love. In the stunned silence that followed the Duke's revelations, he did not press his advantage. He did not look at the ruined faces of Lady Maud and Percival Garrick. He did not wait for the magistrate's stammered apologies or the crowd's shifting murmurs of shock and sympathy. His entire focus was on the small, solitary figure standing before him. He walked the remaining few steps until he was directly in front of Harriet. The town hall, the villagers, the entire world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them in a pocket of profound quiet. He still held the will in his hand, the proof of her vindication. He held it out to her. "This is yours," he said, his voice for her alone. "Bramblehurst is yours. Unconditionally. It always was." She took the document, her fingers brushing his. Her hands were trembling now, the control she had maintained for so long finally breaking. He saw the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes, and his heart, a thing he had thought frozen solid, clenched with a feeling so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He had come here to deliver justice. He had come to destroy her enemies. But standing before her now, he knew it was not enough. Vindicating her past was not the same as securing her future. His future. He had spent years in a cold, silent house, nursing his grief and his bitterness. He had watched her bring a ruined house back to life, and in doing so, she had shown him that his own ruins could be rebuilt. She was not a project. She was not a damsel to be rescued. She was the architect of her own life, and he wanted, more than he had ever wanted anything, to be a part of what she was building. In front of the entire town of Marley, in front of her defeated enemies and her newfound allies, Gideon Devereux, the cold, reclusive Duke of Kestrel Chase, went down on one knee. A collective gasp rippled through the room. He did not take her hand. He did not offer a ring. He simply looked up at her, his proud, severe face stripped of all its defenses, his grey eyes full of a raw, plain-spoken sincerity. "I am not asking you to be my Duchess," he said, his voice clear and strong. "I am not offering you Kestrel Chase. I am asking for something more difficult. I am asking you to consider sharing your life, Harriet, with the man who lives there. With me. Not as a rescuer, but as a partner. To build something together. Plainly." He said her name. Harriet. A name he had never before spoken. A name that, on his lips, sounded like a prayer. The tears she had held back for so long finally fell, tracing clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. She thought of her aunt's parting words. "She'll beg to return within a week." She thought of the cold, lonely nights, the back-breaking work, the fear and the doubt. And she looked down at this proud, broken man who had seen her, truly seen her, when no one else had. A man who valued her competence, who respected her strength, and who was now offering her not a title or a fortune, but himself. A partnership. A home for her heart. She held the will, the symbol of her past, in one hand. With the other, she reached out and laid it gently on his shoulder. "Yes, Gideon," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Plainly. Yes." He rose to his feet, his hand covering hers on his shoulder. And as he stood, he did not draw her into a dramatic embrace. He simply looked at her, a slow, rare smile transforming his harsh features into something gentle and wondrous. In that quiet, shared gaze, before all the witnesses of her struggle and her triumph, a new contract was made.
One not of land or water rights, but of two solitary souls choosing finally to be alone together. 2 years later, the walled garden at Bramblehurst Park was a riot of color and scent. Rows of purple lavender stood next to feathery dill, and the air was thick with the fragrance of chamomile, mint, and rosemary. The garden, like the house, was thriving. It was no longer a place of solitary struggle, but one of shared life. Harriet, now the Duchess of Kestrel Chase, knelt in the rich earth, showing her young son, Abel, how to tell a weed from a seedling. The boy had his father's serious gray eyes, but her quiet, determined hands. At the edge of the garden path, Gideon stood watching them, leaning against the now repaired stone wall. The severe lines of his face had softened. The coldness in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, steady warmth that was reserved for his wife and child. Kestrel Chase was no longer a silent mausoleum. Its grand, echoing rooms were filled with the sound of a child's laughter, the scent of baking bread from the kitchens, and the rustle of Harriet's papers in the library, where she now managed the accounts for both estates with her customary precision. The two houses, once separated by a crumbling wall and a world of silence, were now one home. Lady Maud and Percival Garrick were a distant memory. Garrick's crimes, once exposed, had led to others, and he was now residing in a debtor's prison, his reputation and fortune gone. Lady Maud lived in quiet disgrace in Bath, her letters to Harriet going unanswered. Rosamond, however, was a frequent visitor. Having finally found the courage to leave Garrick and her mother, she was slowly, hesitantly, building a life of her own. She had discovered a surprising talent for watercolor painting, and she would spend hours in the Bramblehurst garden, trying to capture its beauty, her face showing a peace Harriet had never seen there before. Theirs was not a complete reconciliation. The wounds were too deep for that. But it was a start, a quiet forgiveness built on shared cups of tea and tentative conversations. Hannah was now the official housekeeper of both Bramblehurst and Kestrel Chase, a formidable queen reigning over a staff that adored their new duchess. Lady Octavia Fenwick came for dinner every Sunday, her sharp tongue a welcome tonic, her approval of the match a source of constant, dry amusement. One afternoon, Gideon came into the garden and handed Harriet a small wooden box. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was not a jewel, but a simple, elegant weeding fork, its handle carved from cherry wood, its steel tines perfectly balanced. It was a replica of the one that had been used to frame her, but this one was a gift of love, a symbol of the trial they had weathered together. "For the mistress of Bramblehurst," he said softly. She took it, her heart full. The tool of her supposed failure, redeemed. The symbol of her competence, honored. She looked from the tool in her hand to her husband's face, to the child playing in the dirt, to the beautiful, thriving garden she had coaxed from the thorns and weeds. She had come to Marley with nothing but a desperate plan and a refusal to be broken. She had sought independence and had found partnership. She had reclaimed a ruin and had built a life. That evening, as Abel slept soundly in his crib, Harriet sat with Gideon in the library at Kestrel Chase. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow on the book-lined walls. She was not reading one of her agricultural texts, but one of Gideon's poetry books. He reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing the faint, silvery scars on her knuckles, the marks of her hard-won victory. "I underestimated you that day in the solicitor's office," he said, his voice a low murmur in the quiet room. "I thought you were merely capable. I did not realize you were remarkable." Harriet leaned her head against his shoulder, the rough tweed of his jacket familiar and comforting against her cheek. "And I thought you were merely a duke," she replied, a smile in her voice. "I did not realize you were a good man." The silence that fell between them was easy and full, a testament to all the words that no longer needed to be spoken. Outside, the wind howled over the moors, but inside the walls of their home, there was only warmth and safety and the quiet, steady rhythm of a love that had been planted in the harshest of winters and had, against all odds, bloomed. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.